Okay, hey, how are you? What's your name?
Uhyun, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Now, we're going to do an intro for the show. Do you know what the show's called?
Still crazy
Yeah.
after
After
all these beers.
all these beers. So the show is called
Crazy.
Still
Crazy after all these beers.
And the show starts right
Now.
now.
Still Crazy After All These Beers is brought to you by our friends at Michelob, crafting a better beer. And Porta Pong, the world's #1 best-selling inflatable beer pong table at portapong.com.
Welcome, everyone, to Still Crazy After All These Beers. Gary Monterosso with wine expert, beer expert, sake expert, beverage expert, Miss Marnie Old. How are you, Marnie?
Nice to see you, Gary. I'm doing great.
You know, this is the first I've seen you in several years, so it's a special pleasure for me to hook up with you again. We chatted several times in Philadelphia in the past. Haven't seen you for a while. We exchange emails, though, sporadically.
We do need to get you into town more often.
Absolutely. But we're here in Philadelphia having a great time. So many people around trying different beverages. And we have a couple of special beers here. Let's talk about, first of all, we have one ale and one lager. Should we identify the differences between ales and lagers?
Well, sure. And when I'm teaching, this is one of the most central distinctions that I like to make for beginners in the beer world who are trying to figure out how to pair their beer with food. And it's such a simple thing. There is a strong parallel between the style of flavor and the production method that we find in lager-style beers in the beer world and what we think of as sparkling and white wines in the wine world. And there's also a similar parallel between the production method and the flavors released during the production of ale, as opposed to the way we make red wines and fortified wines. So it's really a great distinction, a nice line in the sand to start with for beginners.
Okay, all right.
Now,
obviously, we have a color differentiation, but that has nothing to do with whether a beer would be an ale or
correct.
lager.
You could have a darker lager, like a Schwarzbier from Germany, and a paler ale, like a Duvel from Belgium, and we would find a similar distinction. In general, lager beers, because they are cold fermented, not just because the yeast settles to the bottom of the tank, that's important to the brewer, but to the beer drinker, it's the fact that it's a long, slow, cold, refrigerated fermentation that really makes for the distinction that makes lager so very different from ale. That long, slow, cool refrigeration process acts to preserve the fresh taste of the main ingredients. So you taste very clearly the grain and the hops, but the yeast itself doesn't play as strong a role in the flavor. And so it's almost like, I think of it like the difference between taking the same ingredients and making either a gazpacho or a spaghetti sauce out of the same ingredients. By refrigerating lager, we retain its freshness, like putting it in the fridge. But when we take the same ingredients and make an ale, the warmer, more vigorous and turbulent fermentation releases and generates more esters and aldehydes and fusel oils. We get more presence of fruity, exotic, even cheesy and funky scents and smells and flavors that were not present in the grain, not present in the hops, but were created through the magic of fermentation. This is very much a parallel with what we find in richer red wines that also ferment at a warmer temperature, because we need to extract the color compounds from the skins into the clear liquid that we find inside the grape.
Fascinating stuff. Again, the parallels between the two beverages. And again, they don't have to be in opposition to one another, as long as you're drinking good quality stuff.
Of course. And in every fermented product, whether we're talking about beer or wine or even cider or sake, there is low-end, modestly produced beverages that are really designed more for their purchase price than for anything else. And there's nothing wrong with that, whether it's modestly priced beer that might not meet the craft standards, or whether it's everyday wine out of a box. That's okay. But all of these products, the fermented beverage family, whether it's wine or beer or cider or sake, also have products that have more aspiration, where you see more craftsmanship, that artisanal layer of gastronomic intent behind their production, where they give you more complex and layered nuance of flavor. So it's really like the difference between, everyday cheesesteak or McDonald's hamburger and the foie gras stuffed burger you might find at Danielle. It's the same basic idea.
Okay, let's talk about this first beer. This is from Sapporo. Sure. And this is our lager.
Two Japanese beers here. The lager is from Sapporo. They're premium. And when you give it a taste, it has that rice lager crispness to it. that is absolutely clean. There is nothing muddled, nothing exotic about the flavor here. It is grain, it is hop, it's as like a crack of a whip. It is so quenching and bracing on the palate. And that's what makes it pair so very well with the same foods that you would pair with white wines and sparkling wines. If you would serve it with a Sauvignon Blanc or a glass of Prosecco, this rice lager from Japan is a perfect pairing.
I got to tell you, Marnie, it's so refreshing to hear you and for that matter, other experts in this field talk about food pairings with beverage. That's a hot ticket right now,
very
regardless of the
important.
beverage. Absolutely.
The reality is that all of these beverages are really more like sauce on the side. They're not something to marvel at and enjoy on their own.
They're an
Doing
adjunct
that is
to the fine dinner.
interesting, but the most pleasure that we take from beverages is when we have the combination of great ingredients and great food on the plate, along with a beverage that can do them justice.
Well, this Sapporo is a very drinkable beer. We can almost call it a session beer. You can have a few of these.
Absolutely. Whereas the style here that we have, this is a very special cuvee from Hitachino. It is one of their rare cuvées called XH, and it is aged in cask and almost 10% alcohol. Is that right? Is that or around 8%?
Here it's
I'm
pushing
sorry.
in about 8% alcohol. And you talk about the complexity of flavor coming through in this. It's amazing.
And there are no other ingredients here. This is still just water, malt, yeast, hops, and yet there's so many more layers of complexity and nuance here. This is ale all the way,
Absolutely.
and you would know it whether you saw the bottle or not. The scent gives you those smells of dried fruit and herbs, as well as almost that rind of aged cheese that gives it that ale-like distinctiveness.
Let me get into sakes again real quick. We talked about that last week, but the best sakes are made still in Japan, correct?
I would agree with that. I think that there's some
Because of the rice?
inspiring experiments taking place around the world, not just in the United States, but apparently Australia is on the move as well in terms of making craft sakes. But I think it may have more to do with the life cycle of the two microorganisms rather than the rice itself. I think you can purchase rice from anywhere in the world. The challenge is sort of like the challenge of making sourdough bread anywhere other than San Francisco. The cultures need a certain balance in the water, in the air for them to move through their life cycle the right way. So a culture of yeast, of fermentation yeast from a place like Akita in Japan, and the koji that they use for converting the starch in the grain of rice to fermentable sugar, those two organisms need to have a symbiotic relationship in the production of sake, and any tinkering with their balance, I think, changes the outcome. There is no reproducing the conditions in Akita, Japan, in upstate New York. It's just not going to happen.
Are there, I'm probably using the wrong term, I'm going to call them sakeries, places that make sake in Japan. Do they sometimes, let's say, do a cleaning, if you will, a sanitary process, and then go to sake? Do breweries also make sake?
Well, they call their sakeries breweries. They do consider this a brewing process in Japan, and it makes sense because it is like beer, working from a starchy grain base, and it is like beer, a fermentation process where heating comes into the mix, and that really is the difference between brewing and fermenting wine, for example, where you don't apply heat from the outside to expedite the process. So in Japan, these are considered breweries. They are very conscious of hygiene and retaining the purity of their products, but I would say that they remind me a little bit more of European brewing or European winemaking in the sense that they're also aware that there are organisms in the environment that aren't necessarily visible, but that if you nuke everything down to the, antibacterial hand salve level, you might lose some of the complexity that those organisms bring to your product.
Let's wrap up by talking about a book that you have out.
I do have a book out. It's called He Said Beer, She Said Wine.
He said beer, she said wine. Who is the he?
The he is Sam Calagione, the owner and founder of Dogfish Head Craft Brewery and a big personality on the beer scene. And he and I go head to head in this book, arguing back and forth about which one, beer or wine, is the superior food partner. Now, I have to say I'm partial to wine in the book, and I think Sam might feel equally about his beverage of choice, but we have great fun debating, and really the purpose of the book is to help beer lovers learn something about wine and wine lovers learn something about beer.
Now, if people are interested in the book, where can they find it?
They can find it anywhere at their local bookstore, at Amazon.com, or they can always check out my website at MarnieOld.com.
MarnieOld.com. MarnieOld. We'll have the banner up on the screen for you to check that out. You guys have some pretty lively debates as you do in your events around the country. Marnie Old, thanks for joining us on Still Crazy. Cheers to
Thank you.
And we will see you next time on Still Crazy After All These Beers.